Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Wookieecast. Today we're here with Kevin Burke and Doc Wyatt, a writing pair that worked on Star Wars Resistance. Thank you so much for sitting down with us today. Um,
Having
Thank you
would
for
us.
having
you
me.
would you like to let people know some of the other projects that you worked on that they might recognize you from as well?
I
Uh,
start, Doc?
sure. Well, we um, really kind of we've started with Marvel Animation, writing episodes of Iron Man Armored Adventures and Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes. We became head writers on a show called Avengers Assemble, and then we did the fourth season of a show called Ultimate Spider-Man, and then subsequent to that, we were head writers on a show called Marvel's Spider-Man.
Yeah, we went on. We for Hasbro. We've done Stretch Armstrong, Transformers Bot Bots. We've been doing Ninjago for years. We've been doing just all kinds of stuff written for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. We've been very fortunate, and we've done a breadth of different work in different genres. And one of the things that has been so enjoyable about this career is we've got to work on a lot of shows that we're fans of, that are in worlds that we grew up in and always wanted to work in. And we've had a chance to do that, which is really fantastic for us.
I've heard that several writers kind of migrated from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to Resistance with Brandon Onman. Was that the case for you guys as well?
Oh yeah, we worked with Brandon. We first met Brandon working on Iron Man Armored Adventures, and then it continued working with him on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And yeah, it was through Brandon that we started working on Resistance.
What would you say was one of your favorite characters to write for Resistance?
Well, because of this, I went back and was starting to revisit some of it. It's been a little bit of time since we wrote these episodes, and being deep in various Star Wars lore, I found Kaz to be the most enjoyable character to write because he was unlike most leads in Star Wars shows. Do you know what I mean? Like he didn't come in as the kid who didn't know what he was doing and didn't know his way around places to find out that he would grow into some special position. He came in somewhat cocky. He came in as both his parents were alive. He came in completely from a different angle and had a almost like a humility journey that he had to go on to become good at what he did, as opposed to like a straightforward hero's journey. And I thought that was awesome. It was a new take. It was an interesting angle, and even still, there isn't quite that character as a lead in any of the Star Wars series.
For me, it was Poe. It was really fun to do Poe, you know.
It's amazing to see him kind of come back in like in that era before the films because they had the voice acting and all that. It's very interesting to see him kind of come back in that capacity.
Yeah,
Um,
it was also great that they brought in the actors, which was
right.
common. Having done so many Marvel shows, it isn't always that they can get the cast to come do one of the television series, and they came in for all of that, which was awesome.
What is your general process for writing an episode together? Because I think you were one of the only writing duos that was working on Resistance at the time. So it's kind of a
Yeah,
collaborative process
we're
more
one of
so.
yeah we're one of the only writing duos sort of out there. Those remain consistently a partnership, and part of that is the back and forth. Like Doc and I don't sit in the same room typing. We'll break stories together, and then we each kind of brainstorm, go work on different. We usually split it in half to start a script, and then we trade halves, and then we keep kind of going back and forth. So by the time it's ever read by anybody, it's been through our hands individually a number of times.
Did
And
you
in
have
terms
any particularly favorite scenes that you guys workshop together?
Favorite scenes?
Well, for me, the sort of all the fun stuff around core problem, ejecting the droid swap, and flying through the gravity wells inside the court out planet. It gave us an opportunity to kind of be doing something that was uh, super relevant and super tied into what was happening in the movies, but also kind of do our own unique stuff that you don't get to see anywhere else. I really loved that stuff.
Yeah, I would agree. I I liked. the stuff we did in Triple Dark early on, because there's something about not knowing where this series was headed. Do you know what I mean? We knew where it was headed, but as Kaz is trying to figure out, is there something really happening? Do you know, like the sort of, it's almost a metaphor of like, is there something going on? Am I overreacting to every little moment? And I do think the core problem is my favorite episode in that it ties the most into the movies. But in terms of sort of capturing what I think the strength of Resistance was, which was this sort of ground level, view of almost like paranoia of like, is the First Order a thing? Is it not a thing? Like that's really captured in those first episodes. And Triple Dark was the first episode of the show. Like there was the pilot, the two-part pilot that set the whole stakes. And the first time we get into sort of what the episodes are going to be about, it's that episode, which I think I have a fondness for.
I've heard offhandedly from a few writers that some of the characters had temp names or production names before they got their final name, and that those names were in some of the earlier episodes. I was curious if you happen to remember any of them.
Radar. Um,
Yeah.
what else?
Radar was for who? Just curious if you.
Just for
I
Uh,
think
YouTube, right?
yes.
Neat.
mm,
Mhm.
The whole series was called Zero when we wrote the first so many drafts. Like we made it,
mm.
we might have been done writing the first series, or at least first season, or at least nearing the end before we actually had a title for the show. And it was named Zero because it was named after the Japanese warplane. Dave Filoni is a huge fan of Empire of the Sun, the movie Empire of the Sun. And there was a lot of components, about that were in Resistance. Empire of the Sun, if you've ever seen it, it's about it's a dissimilar, not a dissimilar situation as Kaz. It's about a young boy who's thrown into this sort of camp in the middle of war and lost track of his parents. And there's a lot of elements from that film and from the show Robotech and stuff that were inspirations for all of us to sort of find some grounding space in Resistance. And the Zero Warplane was what the title of it was, because it was about these. At the heart of it, it was about these jets that would do these, fighting and races and everything that would happen on the platform.
Always curious to hear about the code names. I think like a whole bunch of the movies had code names as well, so it's always interesting how those come out at some point afterward.
Yeah, I mean, there's often a case where you need code names because no one can know we're working on it. You have to be super top secret. But also, some of these names are just temp names. Do you know what I mean? You throw a name out, and you're like, you have to go. With the various shows Doc and I've done, we've made it pretty far in till all of a sudden someone in the legal department is like, you can't actually use that name that on this show, or that was done in the past, or there's 18 people with this name who currently live in California or something. So yeah, there's often changes. Some shows in my heart are still named some of those original names. I mean, there's shows we worked on, and I can't remember what the actual air date name was because I remember it, as the show that we developed that way.
Um, you did write two comics as well for Star Wars Resistance. What
We
was the
did.
differences in developing those versus developing something in a script format, I guess?
We didn't get, I mean, development, we didn't get tons of notes. I mean, I think that our editors at IDW at the time, this was all sort of before the first episodes had come out. And I don't think that they had access to a lot of materials. A lot of the Zero materials were sort of under NDA. And so, we would pitch a story and they'd be like, does that fit in the world of Resistance? And we'd be like, yes. Yeah. And they're like, okay, like because they hadn't read the scripts and they weren't that familiar with the characters, so we we kind of got to do a little bit of what we wanted to do.
And it is interesting if you kind of look at, would say, Star Wars hierarchy, right? Resistance is one of the only, I mean, the only animated show, but one of the only things that's at the very end of the Star Wars timeline. Do you know, if we're going to do Rise of Skywalker as sort of the most recent, so to speak, Star Wars film, Resistance is happening during the middle of Force Awakens and during the middle of Last Jedi. And so here are the movies. Resistance fits in some spaces between the movies. Then our Resistance comics fit in some spaces between the TV show. I mean, it's this sort of like level of detail that you can get into in the various types of media that this show existed in.
And they were also supposed to be younger because it was for the stories we wrote for a younger Star Wars comic called Star Wars Adventures, which was for the younger readers. So in a way, our the animated series was for a slightly younger audience than the live action series, and the comics were for a younger audience than the animated series. It was sort of like a Russian nesting doll of
Yeah,
audience.
and that's Star Wars in general. I mean, it's even gotten more that way, recently, because obviously, like you have an Andor, which is for adults to deal with some deep themes, and it's always worked down to the Young Jedi Adventures level. Star Wars has covered a lot of age groups, and we specifically had to do that with Resistance. So,
I did have a question jotted down here from a friend. They were curious if there was any intended timeline placement for those comics necessarily. Probably, I would assume more first season, not into the second season, but
Yeah,
we
it was during the first season.
unless Doc knows something I don't know, we never picked like an episode that this occurred between. Do you know? I mean, Resistance generally works. From like the core problem, like episode 17 or so, generally leads up to the Force Awakens. Then there's some space for Last Jedi. I think generally those comics were in the between 1 and 17. They're somewhere in
not
those.
too late on, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, before
Yeah.
the before Force Awakens really begins, but after he had been established, on the platform and gotten some legs there. So it's definitely season 1, but we never said it is absolutely between episodes like 12 and 13. That was not.
Any placement is helpful because you could technically put them at the end of season two, I guess, if Wikipedia wise, we don't really know where to place things. So
Yeah,
thank you.
well, yeah. So if you're making that timeline, I would put it somewhere in the middle of season 1.
It's funny, some of the questions we asked, like why you probably never get asked that on any other interview, but we would like to know. So we try to document everything. So
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked. Just to be clear, it's not that we don't think
mm,
about it or don't care about this particular timelines. We want to put it in there and make it open enough that there's possibilities. Let's say someone wanted another issue of a comic and they wanted it in a different spot, that we had a little bit of freedom to make sure that it all played. So that's how we approach that. We also didn't want to get bogged in for readers. Like you don't want a reader of a comic, especially a young
of
comic, to
course.
come in and be like, this takes place between episode 12 and you want it to work on its own, right? Need it to
Hmm.
work as its own piece of material that I don't have to think about, oh crap, my 12 episodes behind to understand any of this. You just need to know this is firmly its own story, and if I liked it, I'm going to go watch that TV series and follow it from there.
Some questions that some of our editors had from the episodes themselves. I'd love to get into some of that. The Triple Dark introduced the angle of the pirates working with the First Order. What inspired that idea?
Well, I mean, some of those ideas were part of the overall season arc, right? So we came in. That was part of the first story summit that we had up at the Lucasfilm Ranch and the Skywalker Ranch, and we had come in, and that was already sort of an establishing um, theme. That there were going to be pirates on this platform, right? And we weren't sure how we trusted the pirates or not trusted the pirates. There was going to be the First Order. One thing we did know was that eventually the pirates and the First Order would be interconnected. What we wanted to establish early, and why it was chosen in that episode, was to sort of set up a villain that we could actually deal with on a day-to-day, on an episode basis, that wasn't the First Order. What we didn't want the series to do was get into fighting the First Order by like the third episode, and every episode would be just fighting the First Order, right? It was a slow burn to figure out what they were up to, and so in some ways the pirates were filling in that space for the First Order. That they could be a threat, they could be immediate, and we all knew there was something even worse behind them. And there were some similarities to Clone Wars in that sense, where that the Separatists have the Emperor behind, Palpatine behind them, but so do the clones. There's always been, Star Wars is good this way. There's always like layers of villainry, and we can have an immediate fight, an immediate thrilling section with some people, and not know the machinations behind the scenes between all of them.
There's also echoes of real life in there. I mean, in the days of high piracy, governments would hire pirates to harass
Mm.
enemy, the ships of enemy governments. And like Star Wars has always done a good job of sort of touching on actual historical events and echoing them.
Um, Another question from the Platform Classic. A lot of people really liked the emotional, I guess, density of the episode because there's a lot of tension between Jarek and his brother. What was it kind of like introducing Marcus Speedstar as an entirely new character to the audience? And some of the inspiration behind that.
Well, the inspiration initially was that it was going to be Han and Chewie that were going to come to the platform, and that was the original creative conception. And then it was, then we ultimately weren't allowed to use those characters, and so in order to make the story work, we needed to find an emotional hook or a relationship to hang that on. And that's where the concept of, I mean, if it isn't a character you know and already recognize who suddenly shows up, then how do we get into a character story about this? And how do we introduce this new character, and what gives us this, what makes it worth telling this story? And so we hit on the brother thing as a way to sort of instantly create the kind of tensions, the kind of character drama that we needed in order to propel that story and not make it just a race, just another,
Right.
lap around the
Yeah,
track.
it gave us a chance to deepen all the characters involved. I mean, the minute we brought in his brother, it was history. I mean, we could immediately, and it's history that we did not know. One thing about using any legacy characters is we generally know a lot of the history. So the minute you start throwing in a character already know, everyone wants to be like, well, when did this fit in? And I want to know between this. We had the freedom of a new character to come in and be like, we can make up any backstory we need to, and then move forward, with that character if we need to.
It's interesting that they note that Marcus Speedstar isn't his actual name. Um, but would you say that his first name is probably just Marcus, or do you think the whole name is just a pseudonym that he goes by in the wider galaxy?
You know what? I'm not sure I can speak to that in terms of the lore, because it's possible that they set things up and changed some aspects of the lore, but there was definitely an aspect of us not wanting to know that it was his brother from the
Cool.
start. I mean, we didn't want to do
Yeah.
that. As to, and maybe Doc knows more than I do because I haven't seen anything to suggest otherwise out there, in lore.
In my mind, his Marcus is his real first name.
Cool. Um, and also the last question from that episode is, what was it like delving a bit more into Yeager's backstory with his lost family? Because he had family at one point that
Yeah.
perished because of his actions. So what was some of that like?
Well, I would say that to me is the heart of the story. Like that's what deepens all the characters. I mean, like that. Yeah, there's an exciting race. That's all cool stuff. But to find out that this person that's been somewhat stoic and a little bit and guarded, has some darkness and some regrets in his past, it was super powerful. And that's, in my opinion, that's what Star Wars is best at. Do you know what I mean? Is finding out these deep, rich character things that make you care about these characters, to make you care about them. There's more there than you realized. I think that's, if there's one takeaway to the episode, it's that. Do you know what I mean? It's an episode about regret and overcoming loss, and that's very much at the heart of it and the heart of his character.
Let's see. Um, Moving on to the next episode, the First Order occupation deals heavily with the First Order's crackdown on the Colossus and residents. Someone would like to ask, did you draw on any real-world examples or take any inspiration from them when coming up with that? Because as the wider themes of Star Wars, it does draw on a lot of real-world concepts with citizens and their governments.
Absolutely. Star Wars sort of always had. I mean, we wrote it in, gosh, I'm going to say 2017 was when we wrote that script, maybe even 2016 possibly. Um, so it's difficult to place it in an exact real world context. But what's interesting is since Resistance was written, things like Andor and stuff really started to deal into similar themes. You know what I mean? These themes of, are we cracking down on citizens? How is the Empire getting controlling the situation? We never really got to see that in any of the Star Wars films. Like the prequels, there is no Empire, until the very end. And in the later Star Wars films, there's some at the beginning of New Hope, but there isn't a much because you're following the Jedi at that point. I mean, not the Jedi, you're following the rebels at that point. So you're not really seeing what happens to citizens on a day-to-day basis. this was a great opportunity to deal with that. Do you know what I mean? And I think there are a lot of real world parallels, dating back hundreds of years for that. And I do think that's people recognize that. Whether you're young or old, you just know that that's the sign of an oppressive government or a situation of authority being misused.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that there was a single historical event that we were looking at or parroting so much. Like it wasn't like the occupation of Paris or one single event, but we did spend a lot of time in the room just talking about how freedoms are lost and how totalitarian governments sort of creep into control and things like that across the spectrum of history, as opposed to using one singular model.
And related to that, one thing that I love about this series, and honestly, all the animated Star Wars series, especially, is they bolster and raise up the live action films, right? So when you see Force Awakens first time, which came out first, the first order kind of comes out of nowhere and just feels like, oh my gosh, it's a new thing. I didn't know anything about this. What's going on? You can go back and watch Resistance and watch this slow build up as it gains power, as it becomes more and more present. And it in my opinion just improves the experience of watching The Force Awakens. You watch Resistance, then you go back to Force Awakens and you have a context and you see how they were starting to gain more power and more presence everywhere. And that's one of the most fun things about doing Star Wars animated is that it fills in the gaps and it strengthens the things you already know.
I guess to a degree, the core problem was the one that tied into the films the most, as you mentioned, in
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
regard.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was exciting. Once we saw that was going to be the episode, it was like, oh man, this is great. Like this feels like a cutscene from the film. This was so tied into it. Plus, visually, I think it's an outstanding episode. I think we get off the platform, we start seeing some strange things. The Kaz and Poe don't know what's going on. What's fun about that is the audience knows what's going on, because the audience has seen Force Awakens, but the characters don't know yet, and there's something fun about that.
And it feels like a sort of a classic science fiction story in the sense that like, you're dealing with, even though they're fantasy science concepts, there's sort of, you're dealing with this could be and the ramifications of that kind of thing. It really felt like an old like astonishing tales sort of story, which was fun.
Um, do you remember any humorous moments that you were able to put into some episodes that you particularly enjoyed? There's a couple of just jokes in there about like a move called the Widowmaker, I think, and just I guess Kaz just being quite silly. And I didn't know if you had any favorites.
That's part of, I mean, as to lines, I don't know, but part of my favorite thing about Kaz is that he's funny in ways that other heroes don't get to be in Star Wars. Like Luke, love Luke, he has to sort of be the straight man and be dry during the course of it. I mean, Anakin, obviously main character, it doesn't get that funny. It doesn't get to be like Kaz. Kaz, gets to be somewhat but he's overeager. He's somewhat terrible at what he does. He's stumbling through it. There's a fish out of water vibe to it. Honestly, like there ended up being, which wasn't part of it, but you see certain films like Guardians of the Galaxy or things like that
Mm.
where there's somewhat comedic leads that are trying to keep it all together but really don't know what they're doing, and he fits into that mold. You know, and so I think that's as a whole, I enjoy watching Kaz try to work his way through things. Then I do a lot of leads in certain shows.
The episode From Beneath took the show to Flix's homeworld and introduced his family. What were some aspects about that that you enjoyed? Because that was a entirely new planet, mostly new family, and even though Orca's there, like it's a lot of new aspects with the dragons and everything.
I mean, it was delightful. It was delightful to get to meet these characters and get to like explore what this family aspect is like. We absolutely it was a backstory we didn't ever really realize we were going to get into. And then in the room sort of went in that direction, and it was like, oh my gosh, we have an opportunity here. And no, it was fantastic. And then adding in sort of mysterious that traditional that Star Wars idea of the mist-strewn planet with something in the mist, and just bring it all in like that was a delight to write.
And it just shows especially the animated series when there were a lot of episodes per season. You know, Clone Wars was like that, Rebels and Resistance. You got to really dig in deep into characters in ways that the films never would, never could, in ways that even the live action, Disney Plus series don't really have whole episodes to devote to. They're shorter runs. We got to, we were picking a character that if you watch the first couple episodes, you would never think would become such a prime character, delving into relatable family backstories, like that's, and it's still in the Star Wars universe. Like that's one of the most fun things about doing animated series like that.
The his family, they all sound so similar. Was that intentional so that you could not quite tell which one was who?
Yeah, there's definitely an aspect of it that was because Flix is the oddball, right? He's
Right.
the one out, and so this idea that there was a generally top to bottom conformity amongst his whole family, and he's the non-conformist. It's just part of the whole vibe. He's the one who left and the one that was totally different than the rest of them. Yeah, there was absolutely that intention.
One other question from one of our editors was, what was your favorite thing about Flix and Orca's relationship?
That's a good question. Um, it's to me, I mean that to me that I like that they always have each other's backs. Do you know what I mean? There's a loyalty in that situation, despite it's like there's a brotherly thing, there's a familial thing, there's an affection there that is well beyond like coworker and thing like that. I think that's that's fun at its heart. There's some parallels to like R2D2 and C3PO. Where you just know they're a unit. This is like these two come together and that's what it is. That's what I thought was the most interesting about it.
Um, I've been asking this to several Resistance writers, so I have no idea if you know or not. Brandon Auman has noted that there was two episodes that were cut during the production of season two.
Yeah, one of
Um,
them was ours. Yeah.
and
Yeah,
we would
one.
love to know anything about them that you remember. We've been piecing together this lost media, one that had Mika Gray and the other one that had Axe Tagrin. And
Yeah.
if you were part of the story breaking, we would love to hear anything you know about it.
Ours was the axe episode that got axed.
Uh,
uh,
as for the plot of it, I honest to God cannot remember all of because because Axe was in a prior. I mean, so I'm trying to remember what our episode specifically dealt with.
I mean, I remember a great action sequence that we worked out beat for beat going down a hallway with an
Yes,
airlock.
for sure.
Yeah.
Sure, but
Uh,
in terms of in terms of fitting it into the whole series, I mean, because it's true, and it wasn't just Resistance. There are a handful of shows, Disney shows at the time, that just had shorter orders, and those two episodes got cut. And part of the reason I think they got
the
cut was what's that?
Disney XD ordered shorter seasons for all of their shows that's
Mm.
and
Right.
so yeah, everything at that stage of production lost two episodes.
Yeah, so they weren't cut for quality, I believe. And again, we weren't. That's above our pay grade, but I believe those episodes were cut because they impacted continuity the least, if that makes sense. Like you could remove them without throwing the whole season off. Like they weren't the last episodes. The season finale, still tied into it. Yeah, super cool episode, super fun stuff into it. Never will be seen by anybody because it
Um, I think it was Eugene who mentioned that Sonara was in a fight scene during that episode. I'm curious if that jogs your memory, if that's something we can confirm, or if she was in that episode.
That does not jog my memory. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
No,
I know.
hey, I have to ask. We're very interested in cut content at
Well,
Wookieepedia, so.
the memory I have of it, like Doc said, it was very much a Terminator style against Kaz episode. Where
Mhm.
Axe was just on a mission and Kaz was like an unstoppable force, and that was sort of the theme.
Right. It's good to know more, and I'm glad to know that, well, now we know the writers, so we can credit you for that.
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to dig that up. That's definitely a deep cut, and maybe one day when there's a Resistance coffee table book, they'll print that script someday. But
Oh, they never gave us a visual guide or an art book, so maybe someday,
someday, yeah, let's get this podcast as popular as possible, so that they have to listen to our demands.
Um, it has been a pleasure. If people would like to keep up with you and your future work, what social media platforms can they find you on?
Well, I am on Instagram and Blue Sky as Kevin Burke 20. I that 20 means nothing, just so that you know. It just happened when I first joined, just happened to be the number they gave me, and I didn't think that anything would come of it. So now I'm Kevin Burke 20 for the rest of time. And wherever Doc is to be found.
Well, if I can, just before I say, I just want to thank you for letting us talk about the show. Writing for this show was was a great experience in our career. I mean, we would do the story breaks, like Kevin said, either at the ranch or at ILM, and I have such great memories of sitting around that ILM conference table for days, just talking about Star Wars, talking about stories with Brandon, with Steve Melching, with Dave Filoni would constantly be sketching. He'd be talking and he'd be sketching, and that he would have a story idea and he'd go to the board and he'd sketch the story idea instead of writing the note card or whatever. And we would take breaks and walk around the ILM campus. There's a little lake there at the Presidio, and it was just pure joy. Writing for the show was pure joy. So I really appreciate you asking about it and getting us to talk about it.
Can
I
I can add to that real quick. I agree. I Going up to the ranch was some of the most fun we ever had. The ranch is designed just for creativity, you know. And Doc and I do a lot of shows where we have to walk through the business department or this department. You know, I mean, like that's not
Mm.
how the ranch is set up. The ranch is set up as just a beautiful situation designed for story and designed for that. In fact, I would wake up at the ranch hotel and get coffee in the little lobby, and Paul Duncan, who did the Star Wars archives for Taschen, he was up there doing the prequel archives. So I would chat with him every morning about like the prequels, and I thought this is pretty much everything I've ever wanted professionally to ever happen to me. You know, it was just Doc's right. It was a wonderful time. There are times where I'll be watching Star Wars on Disney Plus, various Star Wars shows, and have to remind myself we contributed to this. We were part of this giant, story, this vast, complex story in multiple media, and we were part of it. I mean, hopefully, can be part of it again someday. But we definitely have a
Hopefully.
chance, you know. And on
Yeah,
that, Doc, get back to social media.
I'm on Blue Sky, Otherland 71 on Instagram too.
Well, thank you so much. As I said, many, many Wikipedians are Resistance fans, and we thank you for all the work that you've done on the series and for the franchise. And it was a pleasure speaking with you. It was really lovely. Um,
Great talking to you.
Talk to you too. Thank you so much.